Thank you for coming to and tuning in to the July 2024 meeting of the Middletown Township Historical Society. We are pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Camilla Townsend, a distinguished professor of history at Rutgers, where she also earned her PhD. Dr. Townsend has a long record of honors and awards that include the Cunhill History Prize for her 2019 book, Fifth Son, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She is a specialist in Indigenous people. And as we all know, this area and much of New Jersey was occupied by the Lenape. They left, ostensibly by treaty, but they were forced out, often cruelly. They ceded their land, but they retained their culture, their traditions, and their stories. And that's what Dr. Townsend is going to talk about tonight. Their stories taken from her book, On the Turtle's Back, which you'll be able to purchase after the program. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Townsend.
Thank you so much. It's really a delight to be here. Can you hear me back there? Yes, we're good? Okay. I had not been to Middletown before, at least I thought I hadn't, but of course it turns out I have because I've gone back and forth to Sandy Hook Beach. I don't know how many times in my life. But what I didn't realize is that the town itself and the area around it is really so lovely. It was quite moving driving here. Really very beautiful area. Very fortunate to live here. I also especially want to thank the Historical Society, especially Randall and Tom for inviting me. Okay. Now let me see if I can work this. My students at Rutgers always say I'm development or technologically challenged. Okay, here we go. Right. Nulelin tamuhena yeli payek. That means in Lenape, I am very glad that you are here today, or as we would say in English, welcome. Okay. I have not taken extensive language lessons in Lenape. Sure. Can you hear me better now? No. Is it definitely on? Yeah. It's only for the online. Okay, so I just need to really project. Okay, so if you want to hear it again, the welcome is Nulele tamuhena yeli payek. And I hasten to add that I have not studied the Lenape language extensively. My co-author, the co-editor of the stories, the Lenape storybook, Nikki K. Michael, is Lenape, and she, of course, does speak Lenape. I have studied other indigenous languages, but in the case of Lenape, only phrases here and there. So I won't be able to tell you how to say all sorts of things afterwards, just little phrases. Okay. Now, as I'm sure you folks in this room all know, and am I projecting enough now? Are you hearing? Okay. As I'm sure you here all know, the Lenape lived not only in New Jersey, but also in what is now Staten Island, Long Island, and the lower Hudson River Valley. We sometimes say that they spoke 3 languages. In fact, they all spoke the same language, Lenape, although there were different dialects. And in South Jersey, or even Central Jersey, the dialect was Unami. But if you hear some people tell you, oh, those were Muncie speakers, that was a whole different thing. They're fibbing to you, unintentionally, of course. Okay? The language is no more different than, say, New England English versus Alabama English. Sometimes you feel like you can't understand each other, but it is indeed the same language. So they all spoke Lenape. Now, that's not me, is it? That's somebody else's cell phone. Good. Okay. As you also know, I believe, but I want to sort of remind us of this before we get going. As Randall mentioned, they were gradually forced out, beginning as early as the 1600s, when the Dutch, the Swedes, and eventually after the 1660s, the English began to make their presence known. But it really happened in the 1700s. I mean, in the 1600s, there were plenty of white settlers, but the Lenape were in effect still here. Only some of them had crossed the Delaware River and ended up in Pennsylvania at that point. But in the 1700s, they were almost all pushed out. As Randall said, there would be treaties signed, but they were signed under duress. You know, they no longer had hunting lands. They no longer had places where they were allowed to gather firewood. So they, in effect, had no choice but to sign the treaties and go. over time, so many of them lived for a while in the Delaware River area and then on the other side of the Delaware River that English-speaking peoples came to call them just the Delaware. And in fact, you have probably heard of the Delaware in common parlance more often than you've heard of the Lenape. That is because by the 1700s, they had been again pushed out of Jersey, were living on the Delaware River and mostly on the Pennsylvania side, and were being called the Delaware people. To this day, they call themselves the Delaware, but they say, I am Lenape. It really means a person. It's the word for a person in their language. And they say, I speak Lenape, but they are the Delaware tribe. And in fact, there are different branches of the Delaware tribe. My co-author, Nikki K. Michael, is from the Delaware Tribe of Indians in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Okay, so here's a quick sort of line drawing of the line that they were forced or gently and sometimes violently pressured to travel. As you see, for a while they're in Pennsylvania, they end up in the time of the American Revolution and just after in what was then called the Ohio Valley, meaning Ohio, Indiana, and even some Illinois. By the 1820s, they were forced to cross the Mississippi River and ended up in Missouri. There, you actually have the date there, 1821 to 1830, they end up in Missouri. And that's going to turn out to be important later this evening. Okay. By the mid-1800s, they're in Kansas. And then in the 1860s, as you see there, 1864, it says they're pushed further down into Oklahoma, which was then called Indian Territory. So in effect, between the American Revolution and the end of the Civil War, they were forced to move just about every generation. Every 20 years or so, they were forced to hop another state or two. Okay, that's a lot of movement for 3 to 4 generations. Okay, all right, that's the overview. Now, it was a number of years ago in 2016 when Rutgers was about to have its 250th anniversary that I was approached by the deans. They were about to launch into a major study of the ways in which Rutgers University itself had been involved with slavery, with the enslavement of human beings. And they had decided that they wanted to add another element of this study. They wanted to know what had Rutgers University had to do with the disenfranchisement or the expulsion of the native peoples. That wasn't my area of study. I had been used to studying pre-contact indigenous peoples and sometimes languages, but I agreed with them that this was a very compelling and important issue, and I worked with them. Most of them were scholars of African American history to help produce this book. They've since done several other volumes. They're quite interesting, actually. It turns out that, and you will be happy to hear this, I think, that Rutgers University did not have any horrific or direct relationship with slavery. I don't know if you were reading the papers recently in the last few years, but Georgetown University, for example, became famous for selling hundreds of people south right before they would have been freed, just as the Civil War started. So they were, condemned to literally dying because it took about 5 years for an able-bodied man to be worked to death in the fields of Alabama. Rutgers did not do anything like that, but it did look the other way when, after the Revolution, New Jersey ended slavery, but then had a little bit of a loophole. You could keep your slaves until they were 21. And what a lot of people did, a lot of white people did, was take toddlers from their mothers, to children who were too young to know how old they were, and go south and sell them. Okay, so Rutgers was not responsible, but did look the other way when some people who worked at Rutgers did such things. Now, on the question of Native Americans, in fact, Rutgers, the university, was relatively innocent, as it turned out, largely because by the time the university was founded in 1766, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Lenape had already been, in effect, pushed out almost entirely. There were a few groups of Lenape who were still there in the Rutgers area in central New Jersey, and actually as far as Perth Amboy, so not far from here, who were there because they were tightly allied with different missionary groups, especially the Presbyterians. And so they had stayed on as mission Indians rather than, following that red line west that I showed you. So I was able to pursue some of those people, okay? but they were people who had been removed from the Lenape culture because they were living with the Presbyterians. Now, when I was doing this work for Rutgers on sort of what was the university's connection to the local Lenape people, what could we learn about the local Lenape people then in the 1700s, I found myself very frustrated. I had been spoiled, in effect, as a scholar, as a professor, because I had been following indigenous people for whom there were better sources. That is, there were, as you probably know, some indigenous people who did write. For example, the Mayans, very famous for their epigraphy. It's called, I'm sure you've all seen specials on television about the stelae, et cetera. So they had complex writing systems. Others, like these people, the Nahuas, who also lived in Mexico, they took our alphabet, the Roman alphabet, the letters that we use, and used it to sound out their own language. So if you look closely at that, with the exception of the dates, you'll see the word años there. Some of you who remember your Spanish, Mexico, right? With the exception of the dates, the words that you're seeing there are not Spanish. Like there on the third paragraph, I see Mopaca Tirtinon. That's Nahuatl, that's not Spanish. So they're using our alphabet to write things down in their own language. And what they were writing down were their own histories told by their own grandparents. This was written down in the 1560s. Some young person was taking dictation from someone who had been born before 1519. In other words, before Hernando Cortez ever got to the New World. So I was used to having sources like this to read. Okay, if you study the indigenous language, then you can read what they said themselves to their own children and grandchildren. Suddenly I was being asked to study the Lenape, who I'm sure this room already knows did not write. They did not have their own alphabet, and they did not learn the Roman alphabet and use it to write their own histories down. So I felt very thwarted, okay? There were two kinds of sources that I could turn to, that scholars can turn to, and you have probably already heard some talks based on these two kinds of sources. One would be the archaeological remains. That's sort of as close to their writing as you can find, something they wrote, they did, they left. Okay? Or you can read between the lines, so to speak, on things that the Europeans wrote. Read what the Europeans said and then think about it. Okay, can I reconsider that conversation and think about what a native person's point of view in that conversation might have been, right? So let's think about the archaeology for a moment. Now, an archaeologist, maybe there is one in the audience who will take me to task later, but an archaeologist would say that I'm being unfair. But as an historian, I find it very frustrating to look at these sources. You can tell that they used this or that shape to hunt. If you look at enough archaeological sites, you can see that this town was a great influence on the way that the surrounding towns carved their arrows. But you can't really hear what people were talking about. What did they think? What did they believe? What did they want? What were they afraid of? And those are the kinds of things that historians want to know. Okay? There are occasionally artifacts that speak volumes, right? Okay? I mean, this is so much more interesting than your random arrowhead. Okay? Even so, we are left with more questions than answers. Right? Okay. It's a kind of a rattle that they could use ceremonially, but we don't know beyond that. What kind of prayers? What could they say? I mean, undoubtedly it would begin with something like Nunele tamu hena yeli payek, but then what else did they say? What did they want to convey to their audience? Right? So in my frustration and in my desire to help Rutgers, come up with information about the Lenape, I did turn to the European sources. And you will recall that I had said that in that time period, in the 1760s, there were some Lenape who had remained behind in this area, well, close to this area in central Jersey, in order to work with the Presbyterians. Well, some of their young people, their adolescents, were actually taken from the Presbyterians with their parents' blessing, with their parents' permission, and sent off to the first Indian boarding school, which existed then in Connecticut. It was run by a minister, Eleazar Wheelock. Okay? And Eleazar Wheelock actually produced first one pamphlet and then many pamphlets about that experience. So we have all of his writings. And indeed, some of his students, who were these Lenape boys and a few girls taken from central Jersey to Connecticut, wrote letters. And those letters have been collected and published. This book was published in the 1930s, so it has a kind of condescending title. No one would call their book now The Letters of Eleazar Wheelock's Indians, as though they belonged to him, right? But nonetheless, it's a good book in that it makes very easily accessible the these letters that these Lenape boys and a few girls wrote. Okay, they were fascinating. They're painful to read because they were written, in fact, in the 1760s, just when Rutgers was being founded, and some of them had wanted to study in this area because they didn't want to leave home, obviously, but they were not welcome at Rutgers. Now, again, Rutgers was not directly responsible for the expulsion of their people, but Rutgers did choose not to allow any Indians to attend, and so they went off to Connecticut, where, in fact, the boys were abused. Okay. You may be thinking, well, no university would have let an Indian in the 1760s, but that actually turns out not to be true. Princeton, gall darn it, did actually allow some Native American students in order to allow them to study the Bible and become ministers, et cetera. Okay. Tragically, the institution that I worked for made the wrong choice back in the 1760s. Anyway, these young people went up to Connecticut, and as I said, the boys especially had a very brutal time. The letters were helpful in writing what Rutgers needed me to write back in 2016, sort of the experience of the last few remaining Lenape in the 1760s, and they're receiving word that they could not go to Rutgers, and they're going to this boarding school where they suffered. But it didn't help me get any closer to what I really wanted, which is, what did these Lenape people think about when they were in private, not when they're writing formal letters home that are going to be vetted by their teachers, et cetera, talking about what good Christians they've become, et cetera, and how much Latin they've learned. What did they talk about in terms of their own culture and their own desires and own expectations? I started to think, you know what? Let's look and see if there are writings by the Lenape after the Exodus, after they were forced to march along that red line. Because as you probably know, I mean, you folks are history buffs, so many of you are probably aware of this. Many Native Americans did learn the Roman alphabet during that period in the 1700s and 1800s, and did begin to write. There are even a few published books by Native Americans from that long ago. Now there are many, of course, but in the very early years there weren't. So I started to think, there must have been some early Lenape, some early Delaware, who also chose to learn the alphabet from their missionary teachers and chose to use it to write their own history. And if there were such things, did they write in their own language in Lenape, or was it all in English through a sort of a mediator, an intermediary who was their teacher? So I ended up at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. If you haven't already been to the museum, the Native American Museum. Do I have that? Native American, the National Museum of the American Indian. That's the current title. It's got a remarkable building right there on the mall and some really remarkable exhibits. And the best part, if you'll excuse me for being so blunt, is the food court. Because I'm not being like my teenage son, I promise. It's because the food court consists of different kiosks from all sorts of different tribes who are sharing their food. So I would like to put a plug in. But behind the scenes, they store a great many artifacts and documents that different tribes have chosen to entrust to them. Other tribes wish to keep them themselves on their own lands, but much has been entrusted to the museum. And the museum is run by Native Americans, behind the scenes. So they feel like they have ownership there and trust. There I found, several other scholars knew they were there, but nothing had been done with it. I found the papers of a man named Mark Raymond Harrington. He was born in Michigan, but ended up in New Jersey when he was a little boy and grew up in this area. And he became an anthropologist. He was, let me think now, I don't remember the year he was born, but I think it was the 1880s. So in the early 1900s here, he would have been about 30. And he had a difficult life himself. You can't tell in this photograph, but he's actually was a very, very small person. I mean, abnormally short. He had a speech impediment. He really suffered himself. His father suffered from mental illness, but he handled it beautifully. And he chose in that day and age, when it was not common, to become an anthropologist. Okay? He studied with a famous man named Franz Boas at Columbia University, but he did not want to get his PhD. He said, that's not for me. He went through an undergraduate degree, and then he went out and began to work. This is a photograph of him in Cuba, where he had been sent by Boas to do a study of surviving indigenous people in Cuba. Okay. Eventually, A man at the University of Pennsylvania Museum hired him and sent him out to Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And you may remember that name because some of the Lenape ended up there. I had pointed out, and my co-author is in fact from Bartlesville, Oklahoma. So this map was made in 1917 when Bartlesville had grown a bit bigger than it was in 1907, when Mark Harrington, the New Jersey anthropologist, went out there. I think because of the recent movie about the Osage, the name of which suddenly escapes me. You know what I mean, though. The Killers of the Flower Moon, right? It will not be a surprise to you to learn that Oklahoma was going through an oil sort of extravaganza in the early 1900s. So between 1907 and 1917, Bartlesville really grew. It was about half this big in 1907 when Harrington got out there. And he was sent out there to buy objects from the Lenape or Delaware, as well as other tribes who had ended up out there in Indian territory. It had only become the state of Oklahoma a few years earlier. Okay. So one of the things he bought actually was this. It's like a drum. It functions like a drum, even though it's made out of cured hide. Okay. He was committing an act that he knew to be wrong. That is, it was considered and is still considered not good for anthropologists to approach poor people and, because of their poverty, convince them to sell their family heirlooms. But he did do it. He wrote a story about it later in which he talked about it as a tragedy. He had the main character be a Native woman sobbing because she's had to sell some of her family's goods. So you can tell from this story that he felt he was sensitive to the deed that he was doing. And perhaps because he felt a little bit bad about it, I mean, I don't know what his motives are, I'm guessing here, he decided to do something else. He decided to collect stories. Now, that was not something that the people at the museum wanted. They just wanted him to take this money, buy them drums, buy them jewelry, etc., but collect people's family heirlooms. But he asked for people who still spoke the native language, and what he was most interested in were the Lenape, because remember, he was from this area. And he was eventually introduced to this man, Charlie or Charles Elker, Mose Hakund in Lenape, literally the hair of a moose or the hair of an elk is his last name. This is Charlie with his grandson right about the time that, that Mark Harrington was out there. He wanted to meet these people who still spoke the language because he wanted them to tell him stories. And everybody said, oh, Charlie's your man. Not only does he speak the language, but he's an ace storyteller. And every year when we get together and have the big house religious ceremony, he's the one who leads the prayers because the prayers are in effect stories, etc. So he, that is, Harrington met with Charlie for many days in a row. And he also met with his wife, Susan Elker. And he took copious notes, writing down comments about their culture, words, stories. And these were the notes that I found then in the Smithsonian when I was there to see what might they have that had been written by Lenape. And so far, I was still frustrated because these were wonderful, interesting notes, but they were still the words of a white man telling us what the natives had said to him. Some of them had drawings that he had commissioned, the thunder power of rumbling wings. This is based on a story that he was told. If you look closely, there are living beings up there in the windy tree. You sort of have to have a magnifying glass to find them. It's like a puzzle. Okay? At the bottom, you see some religious items that actually mirror the or match that archaeologically uncovered rattle that I showed you at the start. Okay? So very notes, commission drawings, etc. But then I came across a bunch of stories in a different handwriting, actually a couple of different handwritings, and I wondered, what is this? And finally, one of them came with a cover note. March 20th, 1909, Mr. M.R. Harrington, my dear friend, I thought I would send you a few lines of this story. My boy got back from school. I told him to put it down for me from your friend, Julius Fouts. Julius Fouts was a close friend and indeed the brother-in-law of Charlie Elker. Okay. Now, what he meant was that he's dictating even this letter to the boy, the teenage boy who has just come back from boarding school. My boy come home from school. He's the one who's who's taking this down. So bingo, this writing matches the writing of the stories. In other words, he's dictating these stories to his son home from boarding school. Okay. So what we suddenly had was not just the notes taken by Harrington, but stories that had been uttered by a native man to his son, okay, or Julius Fouts did some and Charlie Elker did others, okay. I think Charlie Elker actually dictated to his daughter. And I say that because the handwriting is very feminine and there are some things that are thrown in the margins that would be like a teenage girl would write. Can't be sure, but the circumstantial evidence. Okay? So suddenly I was looking at a pile of papers that were written by Indians. Okay? So I had a big question at that point. I'm sure you're all aware of this. You've got to go to the tribe and ask, what do they want to do? If it's something that belongs to them, that they wrote, art that they made, etc. It's no longer okay for someone like me to just say, well, I'm going to write about it and publish it and show everybody else. Okay? So I went to the council in Bartlesville, and on that council just happened to be serving Nikki K. Michael, who herself has a PhD in history. She had pushed it all the way, okay? And happened to be serving her 3-year term on the council. And she said to me, I will help you. Okay. Eventually, I went out and met with them. This is the government tribal building of the Bartlesville Delaware Tribe of Indians. Again, the main body of the New Jersey's Lenape Indians ended up in Bartlesville. Okay. There she is on the left talking to me when she came to visit Rutgers. I went there first and then she came to visit me. And you can see she actually looks white. It's very interesting. Many Indians in Oklahoma, you probably know this, married white people in the white men, to be blunt, women married men in the time of the oil. Again, you know this from Killers of the Flower Moon. That's not just the Osage. Okay. So one of their children married another white man, and then they had Nikki. So she's literally, I guess we think about it genetically, she's slightly more white than Indian, but she was raised in each case by the mother who was Indian, by the grandmother who was Indian, et cetera. So the language survived and the culture survived. So it's fascinating to talk to her. So she came, I went there, and we ended up working together to edit and publish the stories. Now, part of what we did is just what any historian would do. This is a page from a census record. You can see in the yellow highlight over there, Charlie Elker, Sally Elker, and Rosa Elker. Here, I'm going to talk out of school here. He wasn't actually married to Susan Elker. the woman that I said was his wife. Okay, they got married later for something else. I did find the marriage certificate, but that's why she's not mentioned here. But she did exist. Okay, so partly what we were doing was figuring out more about these storytellers and about their teenage children who were the scribes, right? Who were the writers, okay, the literal writers, so that we could construct an actual family tree. I've bolded Charlie Elker and actually Julius Fouts, the one who dictated that letter that I just showed you a few minutes ago. And then we filled in other people. And most especially, and this will come up later, we wanted to know who they were descended from and when had those people come, where had they been when had they passed the Mississippi, et cetera. So Charlie Elker, as you see, is the child of Mose Hakund, hair of an elk, hair of a moose, okay, and a woman named Tulukwa. Mose Hakund actually was born in Ohio country. Charlie Elker, as you saw, was an old man in the early 1900s. He had been born in the 1860s as the youngest child of an older father, a father who was in his 40s or 50s. So he had been born, the father, Mose Hakund, had been born in the early 1800s in the Ohio Valley. So this kind of thing, finding out sort of not only the name of a father or a mother, but where had they been born, helped us, I think, to put together more about the stories. And I'll go into that later. The other thing that the people in Oklahoma could do, that the Lenape or Delaware out there, would be to connect us, the stories that we were looking at, with descendants. So on the right there, you see a great granddaughter of Charlie Elker in the 1960s. And she too has had a child with a white husband, and you see her little blonde cutie there. Okay, so you can get a sense of the ongoing nature of their communities. Okay, in some cases we were able to talk to the next generation of people, now very old, so the great-great-grandchildren of the Elkers, in order to get a sense of how well the stories were or were not remembered. So we were trying to look to the past through these census records and the future of the stories through the living peoples. Okay. One of the most important things that the Lenape said to me, I at first did not believe, but they turned out to be right. They said, Camilla, I don't think it was really all Mark Harrington, the anthropologist, who was the force of energy here. You know, Charlie Elker and the others, their grandparents and great grandparents, they were real worried that our culture was going to disappear. I bet they were the ones who were interested. I bet they sort of sought him out when he was here in Oklahoma to buy, heirlooms. I bet it was their idea to write down the stories. And I smiled and nodded. I meant, of course, I'm polite, but I believed that it was the anthropologist who had been the force of energy. But I thought, you don't know. So he was working, as you recall, for the University of Pennsylvania Museum at the time he was out there. So I went to the museum, and of course, they have an historical archive. And they still had all the correspondence of all the people who had been working in the museum in the early 1900s. Institutions keep everything. Right? And indeed, Harrington had exchanged extensive letters, not with Charlie Elker, who was really deep in the culture and deep in the language, but with Julius Fouts, the one who's dictated a letter to his son and wrote it. Fouts had dictated other letters, and Harrington had answered them. And the Lenape were right. Fouts wrote to him practically every month saying, I thought you said you were going to publish the stories. We want these stories to last forever. Will you please carry on? And Harrington would write back, I'm trying, but I got a lot of other work to do. And my wife is sick. And in fact, indeed, his wife actually did pass away. He wasn't just making excuses. Okay, but the correspondence constitutes proof that the Native Americans were right. They were the ones who had been in the driver's seat. In effect, Harrington was doing what they wanted, which is really a lovely idea, that they themselves were the stewards of protecting their people's future. Sadly, the stories did not get published then. They were left in those files. And although a couple of other scholars had noticed that they were there, nothing had been done. But now Nikki and I were determined to publish them, and we did. One of the things that I think makes them very fascinating is that it's very clear from reading them that although times have changed, these are being dictated in the early 1900s, in many ways, these people, despite all their removals across state lines over 100 years, in many ways, they had really worked hard to keep their culture not only alive, but kind of as it was. And you may say to me, well, how do you know that those stories were really so old? I mean, they're verbal stories. How can you be so sure? There are a couple of sources of evidence of that. One is missionary accounts. Back in the 1600s and certainly in the 1700s, but it starts in the 1600s, a number of missionaries wrote down a bit about conversations that they had had with Lenape people. One of the things that's, here, this is just a 19th century painting, a watercolored engraving of a minister, a pastor, a missionary talking to indigenous people in a lively way. And one of the stories that these missionaries mention is the story of the turtle's back. And some of you are probably familiar with it because it has become sort of culturally cool recently. The story of Sky Woman, that in ancient times, there was a woman who lived with a partner, a husband, a brother, it's hard to tell, and from the story. And he becomes enraged and pushes her out from this marvelous, perfect, unchanging world of divinity. And she falls down to earth, where she's going to come to know death and life and love and all the things that come with mortality. And as she's falling, one of the pastors wrote, they said they weren't sure if she was falling from the sky down into the water or up from the water into the sky. And his name was Zeisberger. He was a Moravian, David Zeisberger. He expressed great frustration that they couldn't even make up their minds which way she was falling. I'm quite sure, looking back on it, that their point was that they were trying to be philosophically deep and say it's very, that everything is relative, and she herself wasn't sure where the water in the sky ended and which way she was going. But that was lost on him. He described the rest of the story, though, quite accurately, that she lands hard on a turtle's back. And Oh no, excuse me, I got it wrong there. She's about to land hard on a turtle's back. And the animals, the water animals, or in some versions of the story, the water birds dive down into the sea and grab bits of earth and dirt and bring it up and layer it onto the turtle's back so that she can land safely. Okay. See, that was an important omission. I'm sorry about that. Okay. So this story is told not just by the one man who didn't understand it, but by different missionaries in different times and in different places in the North. They hadn't, these were in private records, archived records, not published books. So it's not possible they had read each other's accounts. It has to be the case that they were independently hearing a story that, had spread widely and was shared by many of these people. Well, some of that story appears still in the stories told in the early 1900s by Charlie L. Kerr and Julius Fouts, okay? Not in as rich and detail as it would have been told in the 1600s, okay? They too were men who, especially Charlie, who were not at all literate in English. So it's not possible that they had read sort of a collection of native stories and were spouting out what they had heard. They were telling a story that had lasted. Or this is an example you'll like. This is Aeneas from the Aeneid talking to Dido in North Africa. The Aeneid was one of the pastors, the missionaries' favorite books. It's all about this guy who leaves Troy, he's trying to get home, and he ends up on the shores of North Africa, and he begs the queen, could they have just a little bit of land, just enough land that they could cover with the hide of an ox? And Dido says yes, but then it turns out that he very cleverly is going to cut of an ox, starting at the edge, very thin, in the circumference around, and then gradually going in a spiral to create a long rope. This story was beloved by people in Europe. They made math problems up out of it and put them in school books and stuff. Well, you find for example, in one of the stories that Charlie L. Kerr tells, a story that the white people came, said they wanted just a little bit of land, only enough that they could cover with an ox hide, which when you stop and think about it, doesn't make a lot of sense from an Indian story because they didn't have cows and oxes. But he's telling this story and you think, where would he come up with this? And you find that similar stories told by indigenous people down in Maya country, in Lenape country, in Florida. Where are they all getting this? They're all getting it from centuries earlier when the missionaries around fires had told the Indian stories from the Aeneid, okay? So when you find what they call points of production in different places over time or over space, okay, it proves that there's a root a root story that they were all exposed to in some way, because it's not statistically possible that by magic they would all have made up the same story over time. So that's the sort of the proof that we have that many of the elements of these stories are very old. Tom, how am I doing for time? When did I actually begin? 7:10. So I really need to stop very soon, right? I will do this part very, very quickly. Okay. We find elements of the stories told in Oklahoma that could only have originated far, far away. So one of my favorite stories in the book is about a boy who is lost in the woods, and he's raised by bears. But rather than being grateful to them, he remains a sort of selfish human being, very human in his outlook. And when he's later, rejoins humankind, he helps them to come and hunt the bears. But the bears get even. I won't tell you. Okay. But it's a profoundly bear-oriented story. And by this time in Oklahoma, there were no longer bears running around, eating the settlers in 1910, et cetera. I mean, you saw that map of Bartlesville. That's not bear country. But the stories are still suffused with bear images. Why? Anthropologists hasten to tell us all the cultures like the Lenape that come from the Northeast or other parts of Canada that come from the North, where bears were a huge part of their lives for millennia, are full of bears. Okay. Likewise, there's a story about a woman who is taken prisoner of war and ends up marrying with the enemy, and that's sort of a real story in Native life. She ends up realizing one day, I'm married to a divinity. I'm married to a god. This is not a person. In fact, I'm underwater. It took her a while to realize this. She escapes and comes home, but the divinities chase her, and she says to the human beings, I'm going to have to go back with them, or the water, the storms, the divinity will kill us all. But she says, I'll always think of you. And when a terrible storm like a hurricane is about to come, I'll shake my skirts, and the noise of the thunder that they make will warn you to take shelter. Well, there are similar stories from other Native Americans, again, living far away, who could not possibly have known Charlie Elcare sitting there by his fire in 1907. This is actually, again, from the Nawa people whose stories I read to you before. There's a story called The Ball Player, which is really about a living skull that functions as a ball and has magic powers and helps its owner to get even with a terrible enemy. And there are comparable motifs of balls that are actually the jaws of a puma or an ocelot or a jaguar in widely varying Native cultures. Again, peoples with whom Charlie Elcare could not possibly have been friendly, and nor could he have, read early collections of Native lore because he did not speak English, much less read it. So I think it constitutes proof that these stories really were old and have a common point of production with other old Native stories. I can tell you more about that in Q&A if you like, but since I'm over my time, I will keep going now. Okay. So how is this possible? That someone sitting around a fire talking to an East Coast guy in 1907, 1910 could still know so much about the stories that would have been told even in the 1600s? Well, remember, they're here in the 1600s. They're still living in the 1700s. They're still living. Oh dear, look at that. My PowerPoint did not translate. Are you seeing 1600s, 1700s? Are you seeing 1609? I'm very sorry about that. Funny. Anyway, it's supposed to be 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. In the 1700s, they have moved across the Delaware and are living in the woods in Pennsylvania. They're still living very much as they had lived in New Jersey because there aren't that many settlers there in Pennsylvania. That's why they've gone there. So it makes perfect sense as of that point that their stories, et cetera, are still surviving, their religion, their way of being. By the early 1800s, after the Revolution, they are going to start to face regular removals. But you will recall that Mose Hakun, Charlie Elcare's father, didn't leave the Ohio Valley until the early 1800s, when he was then sent with his people first to Missouri and then to Kansas. Okay, so the man who raised Charlie Elcare literally would have grown up in what we now call the Eastern Woodlands. Yes, it's the Ohio Valley, but it's, ecologically speaking, the Eastern Woodlands. Okay, so no wonder Charlie still knew so much. Okay, they made a strong effort throughout the 1900s. Charlie Elcare was not the only one. They made a strong effort to keep that culture alive. They say themselves now in the early 2000s that it is disintegrating. The last speaker, fully fluent speaker of Lenape has died. Nikki speaks it, but very haltingly, it's not her first language. She studies it in order to make sure that she doesn't lose it completely. And they would no more be able to tell the stories now that Charlie Elcare told than you or I could. Okay, they themselves wanted Nikki to work with me on this book so that they would have it before it was gone. Okay. They had done a good job, though, for as long as they could. This painting was done in the 1960s. It was sold to the museum, the Native American Museum, in 1968 by a woman named Ruth Blalock, who was the daughter of Lucy Blalock, the last fully fluent speaker who later died in the late 1990s. In any event, this painting shows the Messingwe, a key figure in their religious dancing. She did this in the 60s at a time when there were not any books about the Messingwe out there by white anthropologists. There were notes here and there, nothing as detailed as this. She knew how to paint this, Ruth, the artist, is still alive, and told Nikki, because she had seen the old costume that the celebrants used to use. Because again, she was someone who was the daughter of Lucy Blalock, the last fully fluent speaker. So Lucy would have grown up in the time when Charlie Elcare was sitting there telling his story. She could have been in the room. This artist's mother could have been in the room when Charlie Elcare was telling the stories that are in this book. So she had seen the costume. Her mother had heard the stories that were told in the songs and the dances, and she was able to paint this painting, which now, checking with every possible account that we can find, checking with archaeological remains, et cetera, seems to be almost entirely accurate. So up through 1968, there were still people who were the children of people who had grown up in the early 1900s who still knew it all. But now, in the early 2000s, they too are beginning to lose it. They are making strong, strong efforts to revitalize their language by teaching it in schools, by having library groups and library talks, et cetera. But because, as you know, Oklahoma is such a depressed area, many of their young people come to the East Coast or go to California to study and work because they really have no choice. They do come back every year for a tribal religious gathering, and they do it on Memorial Day weekend when most people have, a long weekend. And I was able to go for that. And there they try to teach as much as they can of the language and keep it going. But they feel it as a tragedy that it may be lost. Okay. And as Nikki always says, Wanishi, I thank you. Okay, thank you. You're welcome to ask any questions. And I realized that I sort of raced over some parts because I didn't want to go on too long. Okay, but I'm happy to entertain questions about any element at all. Okay, even something that I didn't talk about, but that you've always wanted to know about the Lenape. Yes, hi, I met you before. Yes, actually, I mean, it's hard for them because I will be blunt, so many of them are so poor. I mean, it's Oklahoma, and they are acutely aware of what they lost in giving up this part of the world. But they do when they can. She came several times because of the production of the book. And this is very positive. Many of you have been to Pennsbury Manor. It's in Pennsylvania, the reconstructed home of William Penn, right along the Delaware River. Very beautiful. I think it's probably about an hour from here on the highways. Someone knows? 2 hours. Is it as far as 2 hours? Okay, thanks. So it's where William Penn lived. So it's one of the few places where they know exactly which chiefs were there, right? Because he kept records of who he met with. So many of them know which of their ancestors were not there. So the Pennsbury Manor Museum has recently they've started fundraising for it, and they've instituted gatherings where they bring several people from Oklahoma who want. And some of them have made a point of wanting to cross the river to see New Jersey, because some of them know that they were from branches of the tribe that were from this side of the river. What they said to me, I was actually at one of these meetings just recently on Mother's Day. They were having one of those meetings there. And what they said then, it was quite striking, was what they really wished the museum would do. And I don't know if there's ever going to be money for it, to do a summer camp so that large numbers of their young people could come for, a couple of weeks and see the homeland, so to speak. It would have to be something that paid for, though, because it's not something that people in Oklahoma are going to be able to pay for. In fact, you remind me, I've been meaning to call the director of the museum and see if there's anything Rutgers can do to help with that fundraising. So thank you. Right, okay. Is another hand there? Okay. Yes, good point. Yes, Nikki is going to come this year for the first time. Have you been to one of these? I have not. Yes. She's mentioning two other branches of the Lenape because they dispersed, right? Right. That is wonderful. So you heard them actually speaking Lenape there at the. Right. 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 And she's absolutely right. David Brainerd and his younger brother, Jonathan Brainerd, and it was because of their influence that Princeton actually did, as I said, take some students, right? I'm really glad not only that it's happening, but that you know about it, because I had heard of this through Nikki, but had the wrong impression that it was sort of under wraps just for linguists and the few informants, meaning indigenous people that they were bringing in, but clearly not. They're brand good. Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful. I'm so glad. Right. Because we can, East Coasters can be useful to them, I think, if we try. Yes. Okay. I'm afraid not. The only details I have are actually not in this book, although I can photocopy it for someone who writes to me. The Scarlet and Black book and the chapter I did there, in the special collections at Rutgers, there are some deeds, some of which are from Middletown, in which white settlers are buying land from the indigenous in the colonial period for, bottles of rum and ox hides, et cetera. And some Indian chiefs specific ones are mentioned. So again, if you write to me, because I could promise to send it to you, but I'll forget. So if you write to me, I could send you a photocopy of the pages from Scarlet and Black. Now, the special collection is all closed up because they had a flood. So you wouldn't be able to go tomorrow and see them, but eventually you would be able to go and see those Indian deeds yourself. But in terms of individuals and the stories, someone else was asking me about, I'm afraid not. Sorry, right? Yes.
When the Lenape Indians settled the area, it's thousands of years, from, I guess they came over the Alaskan Bridge and just went down to south. Anything that makes sense?
Yes, you raise what you didn't know it, but it's actually a touchy subject. Am I being taped? No? Yes? Okay. We probably have different relationships with the Bible in this room. I would imagine for many of us, it's an important book. For some of us, it may be kind of an inspirational book, almost the way a poem would be. It makes me think and feel. For others of you in the room, it may be literally true. Probably not too many in this room. New Jersey isn't full of too many people who say that every word in it is literally true, but there are people for whom it is. So that's a debate or a set of issues that we're familiar with to some extent. Well, similarly, in the Native community, there are divisions about what is literally true. So in the stories, say Sky Woman falls from the sky right here, or she comes up from the water right here. And in some Native views and some other tribes, not the Lenape, the people come out of a cave. And some people say some indigenous people say that's literally true. And anybody who says I came from Asia across the Bering Strait is wrong. Okay? But I am not being inconsistent, I as an individual, when I say, no, it's not literally true, because I would say that about the Bible too, that it may be very inspirational, but I don't take it as the literal truth. It's something that, for me, something we can debate about whether God spoke to the writers or not, but I would say even if he did, it was to pass on certain ideas, not literal truth. So I'm given equal treatment here, but for some people, even that is offensive, because some people would argue if an indigenous person says that is the literal truth, then who are you to say they came from somewhere else? Now, I will say this. There's a reason many get so upset about that. I actually have heard people argue, less so recently, but I have heard people say, well, look, how can you say we took their land if they themselves aren't from here? Nobody is from here. People just came in different ways. My answer to that would be, well, it's one thing when you came here 10,000 years ago, and it's another thing if you came here 400 years ago, if you're the descendant of a Puritan, and 100 years ago, if you're immigrant or something, right? So I think we can have our cake and eat it too, and say, well, it's not literally true. They too were new arrivals. It's just that by new arrival, we mean 10,000 years ago, and that counts to make it theirs. Right. Okay.
But what I see now, considering all of us here, 23 and
yes,
how
right.
far away.
How far away, right.
And, it's just.
And so in the case of indigenous people, and this is where it gets dicey, and there was no country or state called Lenape country at that time. In fact, when I say it was all one language, just different dialects, I really mean that. That is, you put this, there are two language groups along the coast, the Algonquian languages and the Iroquoian languages. You might think of it as the Romance languages, the Germanic languages in Europe. English and German are not the same, but outsiders say we sound just like Germans when we're speaking. Like I say, no, we don't, right? But to outsiders, we do. And likewise, Romance languages, there's a certain similarity there. So the Algonquian speakers, they had certain commonalities as well. But there was no how to put this? If you were to walk from New York City down to today's New York City down to today's Charlottesville, then each village would sound, the Facebook would sound a bit different, just a bit, until finally you get down to Charlottesville, it would be completely different language. Same if you walk from Paris down into Catalonia, and then up to into Italy. When there's no nation state and there's no printing press solidifying it, languages just change little by little, neighbor to neighbor, and it's all kind of a continuum, right? There was no big king or chief or president of the Lenape. There were just lots of very small tribal ethnic entities. And this is simply the fact, but it also leads to political repercussions when you're talking, because then the English did say then, and some descendants, some white settler populations do say now. So we didn't really take their land because there was no country. There were just bands of people who happened to be living there, and they happened to live somewhere else, right? And it's no king, no state, no borders. So it's tough when you ask me, when did they get here? Because some of them crossed the Bering. Scholars argue about this too, by the way, because we're always finding new archaeological sites that date differently, and it now looks like maybe people crossed the Bering Strait earlier than we thought. But roughly 20,000 years ago, they were spreading all through the New World. Some of those people eventually got to the New Jersey area, but the people that we think of as the Lenape may have come up from Georgia and Carolina only a few hundred years earlier. We think that because they brought with them the corn, beans, and squash. I mean, it could have been just the corn and the beans and the squash that came through long distance trade, but most likely some people came too. That's usually how goods spread quite quickly. And right around 300, like around 1300, all of a sudden the people of New Jersey started planting corn, beans, and squash. Could have been just a really good trade deal, but there could have been some migrants too. But then you're really saying, okay, so the Lenape hadn't been there that long. So it does become kind of politically complex. I think if you're dealing with people who are not sympathetic to Indigenous issues, probably the best answer it would be they had been there for a long time, for thousands of years. In effect, they had. Stories like this, the culture like this, had been being told for a very long time, right? Another hand, and if I'm missing key hands, you'll tell me. Actually, your hand is up, Tom, but one more over here, and then, okay, yeah. Right, the language groups largely tracked degrees of friendliness too. Kind of like the French and the Germans had been fighting for long before World War II, right? Okay, and so it's not uncommon that language groups often what's the word I'm looking for, track pretty closely to alliances or enmity. So they were often at war with what we'll call Iroquoian speakers. That doesn't even mean that they were at war with, say, specifically the Seneca, who wouldn't even have been coming down that far, but let's say the Susquehannocks, who were also Iroquoian speakers but lived closer. Okay. Did they sometimes fight each other? Yes, sometimes. The Lenape were relatively peaceful in that regard, as far as we can tell, either from archaeology or from oral stories, probably because the area was not heavily populated, especially South Jersey and the Pine Barrens. I mean, it's beautiful, it's all beautiful, but it's not good for corn, beans, and squash, not terribly good anyway. There are other groups of Algonquians speakers, like down in Virginia, Pocahontas's people, where they did a lot of fighting. In fact, Pocahontas's father became famous because he really bashed a lot of heads together and said, we're going to be a country with borders, okay? And you guys are going to do what I say and pay taxes to me. And you can sort of watch a state being formed there. So they fought. Oh, he was not a nice man. He's not like the guy. He's not like the Russell Means character in the Disney movie, okay? That Pocahontas' real father. So I don't mean to say that no Algonquian speakers really fought each other. They sometimes did. Pocahontas's father fought his second cousins to the death. But there's very little evidence that the Lenape were terribly feisty. Again, probably because there were relatively few of them. It was underpopulated area. It's easier to just move further into the Pine Barrens than fight. The thinking is, and this we can't prove, but the thing is probably warfare amongst Native Americans was relatively light until not long before Europeans came, because the continents were so huge. It was so much easier to keep moving than to fight to the death. But once they were filled, like other human beings, they started to fight each other for resources. Okay. Now, Tom, your hand was up, but this hand has been up too. I don't know what to do. Should someone else decide? Yeah, okay, yes. Yes. That will be told. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. I was going to say, must be August. Right. Tom, you had a hand up, or maybe it was. Oh, okay.
How accurate is Harrington's book, The Indians of New Jersey?
I love that book too. I assume that the person asking likes this book too. If you don't know it, Mark Harrington later wrote a book called The Indians of New Jersey, in which he created a fictional character, Dickon, a little boy who was supposed to have almost drowned when a European ship, an English ship, wrecked off the coast of Jersey. And this was supposed to be in 1602, before there were any Europeans actually living here. Fictional world he creates, Dickon, this little boy, is living among the Lenape without any other white people. So he's forced to learn the culture. And to get back to the question, Harrington used everything he had learned out there in Oklahoma and in visits to other Lenape speakers up in Canada. He had made himself something of an expert, and it's all in there. It's very carefully done. He uses archaeology. He was much more patient than I was at the start of the talk, but looking at an object and trying to imagine what somebody might do with it and talking about it. He only made one big blooper, and this was something that they were all doing then. They all wanted to believe that the Lenape actually did, these scholars at the time, that the Lenape did have writing, that they had a pictoglyphic system. I believe it so much that one man named Rafinesque came along and created one for them, and then said, "Oh, look what I found. An Indian sold it to me," right? And they went crazy. They loved it. They wrote about it. Now, modern scholars have studied it carefully, and it's very clear which parts Rafinesque got from which books. It's from Mayan stuff. It's Chinese stuff. It's completely fabricated, but they were eating it up. So the only chapter where you should think, is when that they have their own literature and they're reading aloud for these pictographic stories. They asked every the 1800s asked every living Lenape at that time, where are the pictoglyphs? Show us the literature. And they all said, we don't know what you're talking about. We don't write that way. We like your alphabet. We're learning it. We're using it, but we don't write like that. So I'm convinced. Any other questions from online?
Yeah.
Right?
Crow tribe.
Was there a Crow tribe within the Lenape Nation? No. There were the turkey, turtle. I'm sorry, folks. There is a third, but it's not the wolf. Yes, thank you. Right, thank you very much. Okay, the turkey, the wolf, and the turtle, but there's no Crow totem or subsection. Okay.
What you were just talking about, was that the wall?
Yes, very good. Whoever, someone knows their stuff. The fictional pictoglyphic story was called the Wallam Olam. I mean, Rafinesque made up that name. There wasn't one really. Okay, right?
Your name, it's your book, Wall.
Yes. Oh, really? Oh, wonderful. Okay. Did we answer all the questions? Oh, one more question. Yes.
Not related to your talk, but can you comment on the current practice of forced museum repatriations of Native American artifacts and Native Americans having the right to vet remaining museum exhibits?
It's tough. I mean, on one hand, I'm all for it. You heard, the first thing I did was take the existence of these stories to the Lenape because I wanted them to be involved, and they're very glad. And they enriched it so much. As I pointed out several places along the way, they realized things and helped me find things that I had not known. On the other hand, it is becoming a problem because even within tribes, there are different subgroups. I recently heard a horror story where the descendants of an artist really want their great-grandfather's work to be exhibited, but a different group within the tribe happens to be in power now, and they're saying, no, none of the tribal works from that era will go to a museum. So even the very descendants of that artist, although they are Indian too, are not able to say. So it's very complicated. I don't know.
And no principles for settling such differences.
The museum and the federal government are trying to work out. There are procedures now, but they're trying to work out improved procedures because of the complexities of different, subunits within tribes disagreeing with each other about what to do. Right. That could have happened to this story. Had Nikki not been there, had different people been there on the council, they might have said, we don't want them published. Possible, right? Okay.
Thinking of your Bottlesville PhD, where there was constant intermarriage, how much Native American does a person need to be considered an Indian?
It varies completely based on tribe. That is, some tribes say you must be 1/2, 1/4, at least 1/2, 1/4. Some, they don't mind at all, as long as you can trace back to the first time that the rolls, the lists were created. And those rolls or lists were created after the Civil War.
Does the federal government have a standard?
No, they did, but now it's been rolled back to the tribes. So if to be an Indian, to say, really, I am in a tribe, you must have a card from that tribe and they follow their own rules. Right.
Little point of information, in the late fifties, I was in the Boy Scouts, we had a Boy Scout camp, and we had an honorary members of the Boy Scouts, and we belonged to an organization called Order of the Arrow. And in the Order of the Arrow, they would do a lot of Indian dances in different camps along the Delaware. Well, we actually had a Native American, a Delaware, come in and he would teach some of the people how to do Indian dances. And that would be spread out, so all the members of the Order of the Arrow, and Order of the Arrows all throughout the United States, but they actually learned Indian dances from the Delaware Lenape Lenape tribe. This is in 1950, 57.
Right.
I remember when I was a kid.
It's
But,
possible that guy was not really.
no, maybe not.
Right.
Anyway, he did say, I don't want to end it. Indian, owe a tongue to love one another. And he used to tell everyone when they ended the campfire in front of the kids. Everybody should have something in Indian costume.
Right.
Doing these things.
I have not heard that phrase, but as I said, I only have a few phrases. I wish Nikki were here to tell us if that were real or not. But I will say in that era, there was a lot of faux Indianness going on, which in a way was good. It's funny, Native peoples are torn on that issue too. There's right now a big exhibit at the museum, the National Museum, arguing that or trying to show that it's actually not a bad thing. The culture is in love with the image of the Indian.
One of the things about the Lenape, so they used a lot of, in their dress, it showed a lot of flowers and natural, leaves. Well, you said, yes, I don't know if he was an original.
Right.
But it was
right.
pretty original for us kids.
And it was nice, it's certainly nice of them to do that. I will say that what the Lenape really wore were deerskins, tanned until they were, and very plain, except for a little bit of fringe at the edge, just so they wouldn't get too worn, right? Not a lot of flowers, right? Sorry, right? But again, some indigenous people really do mind the objectification that used to occur. Others, as I said, are saying in the museum now, well, better that than that they should hate us, right? So it's a debatable issue, and I don't think anyone would be angry that camp existed or taught those kids those dances, right? Gotta run. Okay, thank you. Yes, if someone wants, there are a few books. Thank you very much. It's been a delight. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Absolutely.